I am a huge fan of the first Dying Light game. As a matter of fact, I loved the Dead Island series as well. So Dying Light 2 was a game I was looking forward to playing. It's one of those titles which works so well in co-op. Incidentally, my wife and I both got sick with COVID-19 about a few weeks ago, giving us some extra time to stay at home and play. And play we did. But first let's talk Ultrawide. Yes, the game supports it natively. Even 32x9 is no problem, which I loved. With that out of the way, let's talk about my experiences with Dying Light 2. First and foremost, I played through the game in its entirety. This includes every side quest and side activity. Nothing was left undone. And every minute spent within the game was a minute I spent with my wife as my co-op partner. So first, let's talk about the co-op experience. At the beginning, it wasn't too much of a problem. If anything, it worked really well. Each player gets their own loot and there's no friendly fire, which means that you can swing around wildly without worrying that you end up decapitating your own teammate. However, we found out early on that the loot is only available to both players if they're very close to each other. Sometimes I would lockpick a box and get something from it while my wife's character was in the next room holding off zombies, which would otherwise cancel my lockpicking. I get the loot, so we switch places and she can still see the boxes closed, denying her the reward she has earned. Annoyingly, the game can't even let her unlock the box since it still remembers that I already did it, so she doesn't get a prompt. It's just closed permanently, that's it. As a result of this, we learned that boxes are to be opened when your teammate is super close. This won't happen every time, but it still hurts regardless. Before I address the next issue, I have to talk about the changes in character progression. In Dying Light 1, you used to gain experience and level up that way. This resulted in some pretty powerful characters since progression was nearly infinite. Personally, I really enjoyed that. Well, this time around, the devs decided that this simply isn't the way to go and instead implemented a system where your primary method of getting stronger is to collect inhibitors from various locations on the map. Collect enough and you can increase your stamina or health permanently. As you do this, your overall level goes up as well. This in turn makes it so that the items which you can find or buy around the place also come at higher levels, adapting to whatever level you have. In essence, Dying Light 2 is a lot more RPG centric than its predecessor, and this feels like a downgrade. Zombies now come with health bars and levels. Aiming with your strikes barely matters because your critical hits are now random. In addition to that, it's actually quite difficult to land precise hits. For some reason, the weapons don't seem to obey as they did in the first game. And the health bars also mean that you have to hit the zombie until the bar is drained before actually cutting off a limb or head. Not to mention that weapon stats are also quite random in many ways. A katana at level 5 can actually do the same damage as a table leg at level 5. Remember those most basic zombies, which you had to hit a bunch of times with your rusty pipe at the beginning of the game? Well, those zombies are here at level 5 as well and take the same amount of hits to kill with your fancy katana, because their health scales. This sadly kills the immersion completely and is super annoying. By the way, remember guns? Yeah, the ones that were in the first game? Well, those are gone entirely now. Actually, you do get a really shitty gun later on, much later on, but it's actually more of a temporary self-made projectile weapon with several shots in it. This means that once you shoot it, you have to craft a new one, and it's not very cheap to make either. Luckily, you can still use weapon mods for some cool additional effects, but the problem here is that everything can and must be upgraded. And those upgrades cost a ton of resources. We did every single side quest and side activity, everything the game has to offer, and we're only able to barely upgrade some of the basic things to the max level. That's it. This means that you are strongly discouraged from experimenting since you have to invest all those resources in upgrading the first mods you ever got, meaning that starting over with a different one feels like a huge waste, and that new one will essentially be much weaker for a long time anyway, since the old mod, which you, let's say, have upgraded 5 times, is still substantially better than a new mod which you now have to upgrade from the start, and let's just say that the resources that you have will be only enough for a level 3 upgrade. Now your old mod is level 5, your new mod is level 3. In such a situation, most people will probably do as I did and simply save up to push the stuff that is already at higher level rather than start over and deal with constant weak mods. And the game actually provides more and more options as you progress, but they're all weak due to the fact that they're not upgraded. You start with a few mods and by the end of the game you got like 30 or so, but they're all weak because you only upgraded the first few and now you don't have materials. It really is that expensive to upgrade these things. And now let's talk about co-op progression. At some point, the story will give you tools which help you traverse the city better. You get a paraglider, a grappling hook, and even a UV lamp. These items are useful, but they're given to you in very basic versions of themselves, which can of course be upgraded to be much better. The problem at hand is that the game will only allow the host of the game to do this. Upgrade, I mean. This meant that my gear was upgraded to the max, while my wife's was not. She was walking around with the most basic stuff. And since the map is huge, you're expected to run around a lot. Guess how well that works when one of you has a much better paraglider than the other. In essence, the difference is so substantial that we either skip using it, which in some cases makes it impossible to reach certain places, which we have to reach, or I use it and she simply waits for me to teleport her once I have arrived to a destination. The latter option was the only viable one, meaning that for the most part, after we've reached a certain section of the game, and I'm not exaggerating, she was just waiting around while I was traveling. This is so stupid that I doubt they actually playtested it and were like, yeah, this is how we want the game to be. Fuck you. The problem here is how the game is meant to be played. The devs clearly didn't really intend for you to play the whole thing together start to finish. That's probably also why every player has their own story progression. They just wanted you to join other people's games from time to time, but the rest of the time you were probably supposed to play solo. If this had been the only problem with the game, I would have been more forgiving, but sadly it isn't. At one point, we realized that she often can't see certain points of interest which we had discovered. The game has some points at which you have to decide which faction to give a new location to. This supposedly affects the story and also gives you a reward. The rewards received by each faction are different, so you have to pick wisely. Many of them are environmental. For example, you get various zip lines all around the map, or you get jump pads which make you jump higher. Well, at times my wife would simply not see these things. I see the jump pad, I can jump on it. She's right next to me, she cannot see it, and if she tries to jump on it, nothing happens. Initially I was upset that it bugs out and she can't see some things, only to find out later that sometimes this happens even to me. I would lose points of interest on the map, and I would sometimes simply lose these environmental rewards as well. The points of interest, which I have mentioned, are particularly bad in some situations because they include metro stations, which once cleared of zombies can be used to fast travel. It just so happens that those would disappear from the map occasionally and you cannot use them to teleport. If you run up to the place manually, by just literally running up, the game recognizes it as completed, but the icon simply cannot be seen on the map, and therefore you cannot use it. Relogging a few times may help, but didn't always do it. And sometimes I wouldn't see a place that she would see, and other times we both wouldn't see it. Usually it would be much worse for her since I'm the host, but sometimes it would be just as bad for me. And since I've mentioned the factions in this game, let's talk about that. First of all, early information indicated that there would be 3 interactable factions available. Well, there's only 2 of them. No matter, 2 is also okay when done properly, but sadly that's of course not the case. First of all, let's talk about the rewards that I've mentioned earlier. You will occasionally gain control of important infrastructure and be asked to choose which one of the 2 factions should take over it. The game initially sells this as an important story-related choice with huge consequences, but that's mostly not true. In terms of how the story develops, these choices barely matter. What does matter, however, are the rewards you get for doing so. And here you are yet again forced to stick to one faction which essentially will gain most if not all of our support. The reason for this is that the rewards get better the more infrastructure you dedicate to the same faction. If you want to get the best stuff, you have to essentially give them pretty much everything. I mean, technically you're not forced to do this. You could divide them fairly between the factions, but that also means for you that you will only be able to get the most basic rewards from both sides and miss out on all the cool stuff you get at the end. Ultimately, we see yet another system where the game forces the player's hand, even if in a passive way, and I don't like that. Let's address the game's map, shall we? At the start, we are limited to a part of the city which then opens up as we push through the story quests. As is tradition in my family, no story quests are to be done as long as there are side quests and activities available, and boy are there many. Clearly the developer's mantra here was quantity over quality, so there are lots of parkour challenges, night activities, side quests, etc. The parkour challenges are simply time trials in which you have to cross checkpoints as fast as possible. There are a few combat ones as well, but at the end of the day it all gets really boring really fast. The activities are far more rewarding since they often provide us with inhibitors which increase our stats and get us closer to leveling up. Besides those, you can also gain experience which unlocks perk points. These can then be used to unlock perks, obviously, such as wall climbing or, for example, stomping the heads of knocked over enemies, and many others. Most of these perks were actually quite useless, and I feel as though Dying Light yet again did this much better. When I say Dying Light, I mean the first one. The problem with the activities was that they were all the same, or let's just say they felt the same. They might have been at a different location, but in essence it was always the same thing that you did. Take metro stations for example. The map layout is literally always identical. If you have done one, you have done them all. Or medical facilities. Do one and again you've done them all. They essentially thought up of one thing and copy pasted it a few times over the map. There you go, content. The only original activities were the ones which involved turning on the electricity by solving an environmental puzzle. Those puzzles, while in essence similar, were at least distributed in such a way that it made you feel like you're doing different things. So those are the ones I liked. The side quests are many, and sadly the majority of them sucked ass. The devs here were so lazy that they simply made a few of those side quests into regular old time trials. You talk to an NPC, he tells you he needs you to make a delivery, and suddenly you find yourself with a timer and various checkpoints. It's the literal thing from earlier, a time trial masked as a side quest. Then the game introduced the repeatable side quests. You meet a character who looks somewhat interesting and he or she gives you a simple fetch or kill quest. You do it and suddenly the NPC offers you the same quest again, 10 times. That's right, you get to repeat the quest 9 more times before it's all over. At least the game had the decency of making the NPC share some drama with you the closer you get to the end. One such quest chain actually ended up with our protagonist getting some ass, so at least there was something for him. There's one more thing I have to talk about, and those are the supply drops which are stuck somewhere on buildings or other random places, even underwater. If you can reach them and open these boxes, you will find inhibitors and other nice things inside. In many cases you can't see them, but the climb is mostly impossible early on, since we now spend stamina as we climb stuff. This means that if the stamina hits 0, our character lets go and falls to his death. I found this to be annoying, even if somewhat realistic, but grew to kinda love it at some point, since it forced me to use some of the unlocked parkour skills in unorthodox ways in order to cheese the game and still reach places I'm not supposed to be able to reach yet. In some cases, I was required to even have the grappling hook in order to be able to reach certain high elevations, but after a lot of trial and error and experimentation, I was able to do it pretty much everywhere without the grappling hook, which was much harder than intended, but so rewarding once it worked. Last but not least, let's talk about the main quests. I tried doing as few of them as possible at first. The game is designed in such a way that you have to do a bunch of side quests, and by a bunch I mean a ton. Then once you finish all of them, you are forced to do some story quests due to having no other option, and after you reach a certain section of the story, new side quests will pop out. We would always prioritize the side content and only ever progress the story once there was literally nothing else left to do. The problem here is that the map is huge and almost all quests just ask you to run around without anything particularly fun happening. While there's a greater variety of zombies than in the first game, almost all of them only appear at night, and even then they're relatively rare. The streets are mostly covered with basic enemies and screamers. If a screamer notices you, it screams and a chase starts. The chase is the dumbest thing ever. Essentially you get to run around, and the longer you are chased, the higher the level of pursuers that will chase you, which leads to, at some point, even volatiles emerging. This is also where another problem will rear its ugly head. You see, if a volatile pounces on you, you are instantly dead. Well, instantly dead if you turned off the QTE mashing and instead selected the hold the button option. Yes, the game actually gives you the option to simply hold a button rather than mashing it. This is great for people with disabilities as well as people who don't want to shorten the lifespan of their mouse or keyboard. But if you choose this option, you can never free yourself from a volatile's grab. The bar that is supposed to fill from mashing just doesn't fill fast enough by holding the button and you always die. I had to Google this for a while since it seemed weird that a bar does appear, but no matter how fast I reacted and held the button, I would always perish. And after some investigating on the internet, I found out that this was the reason, this option. But back to the chases. All you have to do is reach a safe zone and the chase is over. The issue with this is that the chases are simply not fun, just an annoyance. They will sometimes trigger because the game's parkour is as clunky as the combat. You try to do something and your character just doesn't do it right and you get noticed. But then, there were also a few times where chases would start and we had no idea why. Both my wife and I would be on a roof minding our own business when it just gives us the message that a chase has started. We're pretty much positive that no zombies saw us. There's nobody around us, but hey, we're getting chased now. And the biggest problem that I see when I compare Dying Light 2 to Dying Light 1 is that the night as a whole is no longer scary, just annoying. The only times you will really want to initiate it is when you have to do a medical facility or some other activity which obligatorily requires you to do it during the night, since otherwise there will be volatiles in these facilities or other places which hide there during the day, and as you know, a volatile will cause an instant death almost as soon as they see you. They can't even be pushed off by your co-op partner. Any other zombie, if it grabs you, your partner can actually inflict some damage on it and force it to let go. The volatiles, however, just have no hitbox once they grab you. There's nothing that can be done. Once they decide that they are pouncing your character, nothing can stop the animation. You can't even avoid them in any way. They lock on, and no matter what you do or how you move, you will get pounced, and if you are not mashing buttons, you'll die 100% of the time. I just can't stress enough how much better the first game was at this as well. And I've mentioned how the combat is stupid at the start of the review. Let's talk about the parkour. Within the first section of the game, the buildings are lower and it's a lot more manageable. Once you reach the second map, which is much larger and where the buildings are really tall, you will be expected to rely heavily on your paraglider and grappling hook. The problem here is that this second map is where you will spend the majority of the gameplay. This is where the game really opens up. This is where you're supposed to be for the most part. And trust me, it's just stupid and not fun at all to have to fly around all the time. Flying sounds like fun, but it really isn't here. You could still choose to run and not use the glider, but the problem is that it's not only much slower, but also not as satisfying as it was in the first game. Our character, Aiden, simply feels slow and heavy, if that makes sense. Many of the parkour skills are pointless, and the only time you will use many of them and see some benefit from having unlocked those is when you try to cheese by reaching places before unlocking the paraglider or grappling hook. At least that's how it was for me. In my case, this happened because I simply postponed the main quest for as long as possible, and the main quests are the ones that unlock these things. But if you're not a completionist like I am, you will actually unlock those tools way earlier and probably see next to no value from most parkour skills since they're kinda useless. And the biggest problem is that they're often not reliable or enjoyable to use. I've had tons of cases where I wanted my character to do something and he simply did not play along, leading me to fall off and lose climbing progress. Because some of these buildings are really tall, so falling off can mean that you just lost 5 minutes of climbing, which may not sound like a lot but is. The story quests are generally better than the side activities, but that doesn't say much since the side quests were clearly scraped from the bottom of the barrel. So instead of talking about the main quests, I would like to talk about the story and its characters. The short version is both story and characters suck. There are some cool moments later on, but they are very few and far between. For the most part, our character is being used by everyone and goes along with whatever is asked of him, in hopes of receiving information which he desperately needs. Even when doing his part, the NPCs often don't give him the promised reward, but Aiden is so gullible that he's easily convinced to keep working for them. I did mention earlier that there are only 2 factions, but that is not entirely true. There's a third one, but you can't really choose to side with it in any way. They're called the Renegades and look like punk bandits. The thing I found funny is that literally all of them talk exactly like psychos from Borderlands. The NPCs you interact with are either lifeless and boring or incredibly annoying. At one point, the game is trying to sell me a female character who is very edgy, super annoying, and supposedly someone who may even be a love interest for Aiden. Our character's interactions with her are very few and she is almost never very useful, but our protagonist really likes her. This is a clear example of how not to write a character in your story. When done poorly, you create a huge discrepancy between how our protagonist feels and how the player who's in control does. The result was that I tried to avoid her as much as possible and rejected every option which would have been to her benefit. Another major problem is that the game will often not really respect your choices to begin with. Without spoiling anything, I can say that right before the ending, you get to make a choice which will affect it. The game basically fooled me into choosing something I didn't want at all by not formulating the options properly. If you play the game, you will know what I mean. These kinds of things really piss me off. Something else which I disliked was that the game will often fade to black and load the level while in this state. This creates the impression that there are no real loading screens at first when everything loads quickly. However, as you progress through the story, you will have to wait for longer and longer black screens, in some cases over 15 seconds or more. One time the game just loaded the level but never really turned on the lights for me. I was standing there and waiting until I realized that I can hear the environment, which indicated that everything had loaded, and if I decided to click the mouse button for a swing, I could hear Aiden do his grunt and everything else, but it was still black screened, so I had to reload and that fixed it. And I have to emphasize that I have an NVMe SSD which is generally quite fast. Imagine how long those black screens would be on an old-fashioned hard drive. When the loading times are this long, I'd rather have a classic loading screen with a progression bar than a black screen. So to summarize, Dying Light 2 was a major disappointment. Literally everything felt like a huge downgrade from the first game. Even things like the perks, which have increased in numbers, still felt like a step back. So even when they did more, they actually achieved less. And I didn't even mention that the second part of the game felt incredibly rushed, where you feel like the story is just getting started and it suddenly reveals everything in a few quests and ends abruptly. I remember having a blast with the first game and even replaying it multiple times. Dying Light 2 was mostly boring and I simply can't see myself replaying it at all. And I'm a huge fan of the series, so I was initially biased towards liking it. I wanted to love this game because I loved the predecessor so much, and the other games with similar settings released by the same developer. But with this many bugs, the repetitive, boring content, the way everything simply feels less refined than in the first game, and the bad co-op experience, at some point I had to admit that I'm not having as much fun with this game as I wanted to, and by far not as the first one. So I cannot recommend Dying Light 2. The problems here are many and most of them are so fundamental that there's no way to fix them without making the game again. If you have never played the first part, I'd actually recommend you start with this one and then once you finish it, move to the first. That way you won't be as disappointed as I was. Knowing that everything can feel and play that much better makes the experience even worse in my eyes. With that having been said, I want to thank you for watching Game Filter. I hope this review has been informative and would love to see you again next time. Until then, have a great day. This is Nino signing out.